Thank you, Mr. President, and I rise to speak and offer my strong support for these motions. I want to start by acknowledging our Wiradjuri guests who are in the gallery today and paying my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Mr. President, I think it's crucial that we acknowledge our nation and our state's colonial history in all things that we do. This is even more pressing when it comes to the history of this place. One of the very first acts of the Legislative Council in 1824 was to charge Colonel William Stewart with the establishment of the Mounted Police, who played a key role in the violent oppression of Aboriginal people resisting colonial expansion in New South Wales, particularly in the then ongoing Bathurst War, what should now be called the First Wiradjuri War of Resistance. This is something we can never forget when we come to this place. The horrors of colonisation are not merely a coincidence or a byproduct of our current system of government. They are the very reason that we stand here today in this place. The existence of this chamber is inextricably linked with the systematic oppression and killing of Aboriginal people in our past. It is for this reason that I'm disappointed by the current program of the bicentennial celebration conducted by this Parliament and others. Of course, it's appropriate to acknowledge the work of those who built our modern democracy. We must be very careful not to glorify or sanitise the process of colonisation. There has been little acknowledgement in celebrations of the devastating effects that colonisation had on the First Nations people of Sydney and of New South Wales. I'm sure it's not by design or intentional, but there's been a tendency in these celebrations to idealise some of the aspects of the colonial project while glossing over or even outright ignoring such things as this chamber's role in the First Wiradjuri War of Resistance. For example, the slogan of the bicentennial celebration is, quote, 200 years of democracy, end quote. This outright erases the more than 60,000 years of history of collective decision-making that came before it. Professor Frank Bongiorno from the Australian National University argues that the establishment of the Legislative Council, quote, was intended to provide some legislative cover for the governor's actions in the face of criticism. It was not intended to build a pillar for democracy, end quote. He argues for the recognition of democratic decision-making practices that existed well before the establishment of this chamber in 1824, or even the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788. We have a long and proud history to speak of and celebrate when we consider democracy in Australia, one that predates the formation of this chamber and deserves to be told and recognised alongside its relatively short history. In another example, the Supreme Court of New South Wales, which is also celebrating its bicentenary this year, has been invited to produce a book, a permanent exhibition and a lecture series as part of its celebrations, showcasing the role of the courts in Sydney's early colony and legal system is all well and good. The materials highlighted, however, ignore the long-term and ongoing role that the court and the justice system have played in the oppression, dispossession and institutionalisation of First Nations people in New South Wales. Just a couple of hours ago, I and many others who are here now in this chamber attended the launch of the Alternatives to Incarceration report by the Justice Reform Initiative right next door in the Jubilee Room. Here, First Nations people spoke about the harm the justice system has done to them and their communities and the ways government and community can work together to begin to change this. And yet, we're putting on a bicentennial celebration which glorifies the court and that very system. In my view, it is simply wrong to acknowledge the contributions of convict settlers, many of whom, such as my relatives from Ireland, were subject to transportation for simply seeking to assert their rights to self-determination, without also acknowledging the extreme denial of rights and violence Aboriginal people were subjected to in the same period. To pretend that inhumane decisions were not made as part of the establishment of this place is to deny reality and to portray a false view of history. In my view, the bicentennial celebrations thus far have been shamefully one-sided, and they do not represent the full truth of our past. While good work has been done to recognise one part of our history, we must also find ways to acknowledge our history from all perspectives, to learn from our mistakes, and to invite First Nations people to meaningfully participate as a springboard for reform for the next 200 years. We cannot do this until we own the uncomfortable truth about the history of our state and of this place. And for those reasons, I commend the motions to the Chamber.